Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Darlington. I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's second panel. Mike Berry began his law career after receiving his law degree from The Ohio State University, served in the United States Marine Corps on active duty for 7 years, from 2006 to 2013. During his time in the Marine Corps, he served in Afghanistan and also served as a professor of law at the United States Naval Academy. After leaving active service, Mike then joined the First Liberty Institute, where he served for a number of years. From there, he served as chief counsel to U.S. Senator Ted Cruz before returning back to First Liberty. Mike currently serves as executive director of external affairs and senior counsel at the First Liberty Institute. As well, he's a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps Reserve. Mike?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all of you for being here. Before we begin with our panel, an administrative announcement. Lunch will be served at the conclusion of this panel discussion. It will be in the district room, which is downstairs, and you must take the front elevators or stairs from the front of the hotel. If you try to do it from the back, you will not get lunch. So there's my announcement for the day, and with that, I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished panelists this morning. So to my far right, to your left, is Dr. Dale Copeland. He is the Hugh and Winifred Cumming Memorial Professor of International Affairs at the Department of Politics at the University of Virginia. Dr. Copeland's research interests include the origins of economic interdependence between great powers, the logic of reputation building, bargaining and coercion theory, the interconnection between trade, finance, and militarized behavior, and the impact of the rise and decline of economic and military power on state behavior. And he is the author of several books, and his most recent book will be available soon, and it's called A World Safe for Commerce.
It's out already.
Oh, I apologize. It's already out.
That's good.
And to Dr. Copeland's immediate left is Dr. Jennifer Cavanaugh, Senior Fellow at the Defense and Foreign Policy. She is a researcher on military readiness, deterrence, and political decision-making in crises. A political scientist by training, Dr. Cavanaugh has spent her career studying U.S. national security and defense policy. Dr. Cavanaugh's research focuses on U.S. military strategy, force structure, and defense budgeting, the defense industrial base, and U.S. military deployments and interventions. Immediately to my left is Professor Julian Koo. He is the Faculty Director of International Programs and the Maurice A. Dean Distinguished Professor of Constitutional Law at Hofstra University School of Law. He is a specialist in international and constitutional law, U.S.-China relations, and the Taiwan Relations Act. Professor Koo's primary research interest is the relationship of international law to constitutional law. He has also conducted academic research on a wide range of topics, including international dispute resolution, international criminal law, and China's relationship with international law. Last but certainly not least is the Honorable Steve Yates. He is the Senior Research Fellow on China and National Security Policy at the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. He's a former Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Cheney. A long background in policy, intelligence, and Chinese affairs, Mr. Yates leads the effort to define, amplify, and execute a comprehensive strategy to contain the malign influences of the Chinese Communist Party, to strengthen and rebalance our alliances, and to put American families, jobs, and sovereignty first. So, thank you to each of our panelists for being here, and thank you to our guests as well. The way I thought we would do this is the typical panel format that most of you are probably familiar with. I'm going to have a number of directed questions for each of our panelists. We'll go for a while depending on how much time we have, and then with about 15 minutes remaining, maybe 20 minutes remaining, I'm going to open it up for audience Q&A. So to set the stage for our discussion on Taiwan and the rule of law, U.S. policy and legal commitments in a time of crisis, our discussion today explores how U.S. policy and legal commitments towards Taiwan hold up under real-world pressure, and how the intersection of law, strategy, and values shapes American decision-making in a potential Taiwanese crisis. So to set the stage with some strategic context, I'm going to first turn to you, Dr. Copeland. Your work focuses on how economic interdependence affects the likelihood of war between great powers. So how do you see that dynamic playing out between the United States and China when it comes to Taiwan? Does mutual dependence still restrain conflict, or has deterrence become more fragile?
Well, thank you, Michael. And let me briefly mention that my larger grand strategic perspective is a realist one. I look at power politics, but I look at economics as the critical element in today's society, today's environment for power politics. This is not about war per se, because nuclear weapons make it quite foolish, but it is about, as we've seen already in the last 8 months, about tariffs, it's about rare earths, it's about restrictions on strategic goods. And those kinds of things can actually lead states to take risks that lead to war, or they can restrain them. And I go both ways on this. I believe that economic interdependence can be quite a powerful deterrent, a force for peace, if you will, in the US-China relationship. And I want to start off with the basic point that China is obsessed with maintaining an engaged presence economically around the world and with the US. It does not want to decouple. And the US has played with this term, or de-risking. China would like to see continued engagement around the world. 38% of its economy is based around trade. And for China to lose some of that trade in a significant way would have devastating domestic implications for the Chinese Communist Party, unrest at home that it wants to avoid. So China has a good reason, starting off, China has a good reason for wanting to keep trade going, to keep tariffs low, and to use, of course, rare earths as its leverage point for maintaining a U.S. relationship that is relatively open economically. Now, let me mention the question in terms of deterrence as it relates to Taiwan. I believe, and I've talked about this publicly a number of times, that there are 3 pillars to deterrence for the U.S. in East Asia relative to Taiwan and China. And in fact, I think the 3 pillars are strong, and there's good reason to believe that China would be quite irrational or foolish to go after Taiwan. I'm not saying it can't happen, I'm just saying that it's probably dependent more upon what we do. Think of Japan 1941 and cutting Japan off from raw materials and how that led to Pearl Harbor. It's more dependent on what we do rather than just some kind of internal desire to take over Taiwan by force. Why? Well, the first pillar is the Bridge Colby talks about it as a strategy of denial. It's simply very hard to cross 100 miles of open ocean or open sea and attack an island like Taiwan with a very rocky shore. And that itself is a deterrent, and Taiwan has, of course, with US help, building up its direct or straightforward denial strategy. That's pillar number 1. Pillar number 2 is what people might call the pillar of a slippery slope deterrence. That is, nobody wants a nuclear war, but we could get into one, or at least get into a war with China, even in a conventional sense, through a slippery slope, getting out in a crisis, getting out on a slope where both actors can't stop themselves from escalation. And then something goes wrong, a rogue commander starts a small conflict in South China Sea, and things escalate. Cuban Missile Crisis obviously was the best case of that. And that's a deterrent for China, because China does not want an escalation with the US Mack truck. In 1995-96, it backed down in the face of the US Mack truck. It's built up its Navy. It's very strong. It has a Mack truck in the region now too. But this is a chicken game, and China does not want to play that. So that's pillar number 2. But the third pillar is what I would call the economic punishment deterrent. That is our threat, like we did with Russia, to hurt China's economy if it were to go after Taiwan. And that is a very powerful pillar. It's not that strong with Russia, because Russia has an independent export of oil to depend upon. But China imports almost all of its raw materials or a lot of its raw materials. 80% of its oil comes from abroad. It needs the Malacca Strait to be open to get those raw materials. It's a bit like Japan in 1940-41, and the last thing China wants is a replay of that scenario. So why is this pillar so important? Well, let's just take a couple of key facts. I said 38% of China's GDP comes from trade. That's a key dependency. But about 35% of its food now comes from abroad, and that's growing each year. And that's a very big concern when it comes to domestic stability. So if you put all these things together, I'd say that the likelihood of Taiwan being attacked by China, even in the next 5 or 10 years, is quite low, as long as we play our cards right and don't start to restrict China's access to the global economy and to raw materials. So that's sort of my basic starting point. I'll let you, ask follow-up questions if you want, Mike, but that gives you the sort of geoeconomic perspective on this. And I will say that the U.S. has good reasons to, because of rare earths, to want to keep trade going with China. So the two of them together, I think, restrain both sides. I'm not quite as confident as Mr. Trump, President Trump was recently, when he says, oh, don't worry about China. I'm worried about China. I believe we need a strong deterrent, and we need to work on all three pillars simultaneously. But at the same time, those are good pillars, and China would be quite irrational to attack Taiwan.
Thank you, Dr. Copeland. So let's pull the thread a little bit further on the notion of deterrence. Steve, I'm going to turn to you and ask, if we were to observe a crisis that falls short of actual invasion, say a blockade or a cyber attack, what tools does the United States have available realistically that could change Beijing's calculus without direct conflict?
Well, I appreciate the challenge. This is a simple question, but I think it's at the meat of the reality that we face. I have a friend of mine that wrote a book where he's talking about between all-out diplomacy and all-out war, there are a lot of options and actions, and that's where a lot of real-life work and real-life government decision-making takes place. And this isn't hypothetical because this is already happening in the Taiwan Strait to a degree. Whether you consider them to be exercises or rehearsals, China has been engaged in by far the most provocative range of naval, civilian, hybrid kinds of exercises encircling Taiwan. It has sent its military to the Pacific side of Taiwan, which has not happened very often in the past. And it's projected its power to areas which have nothing directly to do with Taiwan, but a lot to do with the Taiwan scenario and challenging Japan and the Philippines. And I could give you an acid test for rationality and what's unfolding before us. How many countries in the world really pick fights with the Philippines? It's a very, very short list. And if you're one of them, odds are you're the non-status quo power. You're the bad guy. So we have something unfolding in the first island chain of the Indo-Pacific region that hasn't happened in a couple of generations. So we do have already this demonstration. So what are our options? Well, first, our best option is to get things right at home with our manufacturing, processing, and supply chains in government, in the private sector, and I see pretty solid evidence of a rapid adjustment in direction and pace on that front, but it's going to take time to move some of these dependencies. We spent the better part of 50 years allowing for over-concentration of supply chains, including defense supply chains, into one country. If you had asked someone in the 1980s or 90s, would it be a good idea to have over-concentration of these critical supply chains in any one country, regardless of the country, it would have probably been an overwhelming no. And if you told them then, well, that one country would be the People's Republic of China, do you think that's a good idea or bad idea? They probably would have shaken their head in disbelief. How can you even ask the question? And yet that's where a lot of the somewhat globalist or post-Cold War peace dividend rationality led us. So the invisible hand or other incentives put us in that place. So first, best option is to begin changing the options that we have by adjusting some of these critical dependencies. The second, without the U.S. having to get directly involved yet, is to work as closely as possible with frontline states to increase their own capacity to be difficult pills to swallow, more difficult markets to pressure. The allied and partner relationships that we have in the first island chain, but also to throw in South Korea, there's a profound freedom of navigation interest of all of those governments that is civil and military. But the more civil maritime security activity that is increasing, which has measurably been increasing in the last couple of years, largely because of provocations by Beijing, is a down payment on improving our option set to have less risky, perhaps more effective options for mitigating a crisis or deterring a crisis from happening. There have been exercises between the coast guards of these different countries. They are working on their shipping and other material manufacturing supply chains. Again, this will take years, but there's been a directional move that I believe is in the right direction, and we have options to help invest or support that kind of collaboration. I was in Taiwan very recently with a media friend who was interviewing President Lai there, and I've been coming and going to Taiwan for the better part of 35 years. And I have never seen a more comprehensive and serious effort by the government of Taiwan to mobilize its civilians to prepare for hybrid national disaster response versus the lessons of Ukraine or other places for what should a population do to be prepared in case of an emergency, and maybe that preparedness is its own form of a down payment on a different deterrence posture. And there's a comprehensive publication that's been put out, helpfully in English for not everyone reading Mandarin Chinese. But again, I would emphasize, I have listened from basically the 1990s forward to American experts arguing about these things, mostly in ridiculous terms, but that some of it was reasonable, and I've seen a serious response in Taiwan like I haven't before. Is it enough? Well, again, it's like the other things I was mentioning. Directionally, I think it's correct, and it will take time to improve, but something that is positive, that manages our level of risk and maybe increases some deterrence calculations. There is the issue of the box that the United States government, in its infinite wisdom, chose to put Taiwan in. If you really want to understand what I consider to be the Achilles heel of U.S.-China relations and looking at Taiwan policy, it's the suspension of disbelief that the rest of the world and what we do in the rest of the world has no relevance to the decisions we should make with regard to China or to Taiwan. And if you just look at how Russia-Ukraine has been dealt with, how you look at what's been going on with the Gaza conflict, you go almost anywhere in the world, we do not take the common sense and empirical lessons of those interactions and apply them to how we should behave in a Taiwan context. Simply put, do you think it was a good idea or a bad idea to hold off on deterrent-related capabilities to Ukraine before Russia's second invasion? Most people would say, well, given the way things have played out, and it might not be unanimous, but most people would probably say, well, it probably would have made more sense to move that deterrent material before than trying to rush and marshal things after. Well, do you have an opportunity to do that with Taiwan? And the difference being, to Ukraine, it was largely giving things, and with Taiwan it would be buying. The constraints in that are capacity, but a lot of those constraints were decisional on the part of the United States to put Taiwan in a box where we'd say, we don't fully trust you to not provoke the other side, and so we want to sell you downgraded versions of things. And we're also concerned about proliferation. But the proliferation horse has left that barn a long time ago, since if you watch the PLA parade on its National Day, they've copied a lot of our things already, and they've manufactured things that are more advanced than we seem prepared to sell Taiwan. So at this point, I think the other decisional matter that's before the U.S. government is, if you would like the United States to avoid having to intervene, or to have safer and better options should that intervention take place, maybe you should look at lowering the boundaries of this box that you put in before a crisis were to break out. And the last part I think impinges upon decision-making is, again, if you look at the Ukraine situation, do you think that Ukraine can protect what it has or restore what it used to have if it never took action against targets inside Russia? Do you think that it would be able to achieve that objective if other countries did not put at risk some of the financial or other supply chains within Russia to try to slow the war machine? You can debate whether it's been effective or not so far, but most people would say, you know, in the modern form of warfare that we've seen evolve in that conflict, number one, it's been heavily drone and modern tech-oriented, less old-school conventional than we might have thought at the outset. But number two, both sides seem to be very, very focused on affecting the energy and other supply chains of their adversary. And that's one where, again, U.S. thinkers have usually put themselves in a box, assuming that we would not do anything to affect China's ability to fuel its war machine very, very quickly. And if China believes that, then they probably think they have a more permissive environment than might be reasonable if we applied the lessons of other places. Final punctuation mark is I think that with 50% of global trade container shipping going proximate to the Taiwan Strait Pacific or the Strait side, there's a pretty overwhelming, compelling commercial interest, if no other, to make sure the freedom of navigation is preserved there. I don't think it's the defense of that is provocative. I think trying to change that is provocative. And I do think that there's been expanding cooperation among Japan, Korea, the United States, and several others in that regard, despite what anyone wants to think of in terms of the bumper stickers about last administration, this administration, good or bad. I think that reality is moving largely in the right direction. So with those kind of overview perspectives, I'd be happy to revise and extend, as they say, based on your questions.
Well, thank you. And one of the things you alluded to is sort of as an initial step would be to get our own house in order, so to speak. So I want to turn to you, Dr. Kavanaugh. Your research focuses a lot on military readiness and decision-making under pressure. So I want to ask, in your opinion, is it even in the United States' interest to intervene for a conflict to arise in Taiwan, and how prepared is the United States to do so?
Thanks very much for that question. It's been the one that I've been thinking about since this panel started. I think it's the big elephant in the room, the question that people don't ask. There's an assumption that defending Taiwan is in U.S. interests, and I have argued in other places, and I'll argue today, that I think the answer is no. I don't think it's in the U.S. interest to get into a war with China over Taiwan, and I think the status quo is the best option, but if it came down to it, if China were to move on Taiwan or China were to try to blockade Taiwan, I think it would be better for the United States to stay out, to stay uninvolved. I think that for a few reasons. The major arguments made for defending Taiwan are, number one, that if China were to take Taiwan, it would shut the United States out of Asia entirely, that China would become the dominant military player, and this assumes that Taiwan is sort of the linchpin of U.S. power in Asia and U.S. power globally. And if you do military analysis, if you look at the military advantages that China would get from taking Taiwan, they're actually quite modest. It's only 90 miles off of China's coast. It's not going to get a lot of advantage in terms of how far it can shoot its missiles. There's some benefits to being able to base, say, Chinese submarines on the eastern side of Taiwan, but those benefits are pretty small, and as Chinese technology improves, which it will, they'll be able to move their submarines more quietly out of the first island chain, no matter where they base them. So the military gains would be quite small. Seizing Taiwan would not change the overall balance of power in the region, especially with the United States still having allies like Japan and South Korea, and India being a balancer of China quite naturally. The second set of arguments made for defending Taiwan are economic. Some of them are about trade routes. Some of them are about semiconductors. I think the trade route argument is an important one, but number one, China has made no indication that it's going to shut trade through the South China Sea or through the Taiwan Strait. It's never made any move in that direction. So I think that's sort of a hypothetical. We've also seen in the Red Sea how quickly shipping reroutes. There's this idea that all of these choke points are, that if they get closed, then it's catastrophic for U.S. commerce or global commerce. And we saw in the Red Sea that was actually not the case, that very quickly shipping rerouted and prices went back down. The semiconductor argument is a little bit more compelling, but when I look at it, I think, number one, if China were to take Taiwan, if there were to be a war, do we really think those semiconductor fabs would survive the war? I don't think so. And so if the answer is no, then if China attacks Taiwan kinetically, I think it's likely that we're living in a world in which that semiconductor capacity is already gone, and we're going to need another way around it. Now, that's something that U.S. policy should be thinking about, absolutely, and we already see policymakers looking at that. But I don't think that in and of itself is a reason to defend Taiwan. The third set of arguments has to do with alliances, that allies will no longer see us as credible, and they will bandwagon with China. If you talk to people in Japan and South Korea, they're not going to bandwagon with China if the United States doesn't defend Taiwan. They don't want to be under China's thumb any more than Ukraine wants to be under Russia's thumb or Taiwan wants to be under China's thumb. So they are nationalists, and the most likely response is that they'll balance. They'll invest more in their own defense. They'll maybe lean more towards the U.S., maybe lean towards an independent defense posture. And the final set of arguments is about democracy and values, that we have to defend a democratic partner against an authoritarian rival. As a realist, I have very little interest in those types of arguments. The United States has gotten itself into huge problems in the Middle East trying to defend and promote democracy. I think we've learned our lesson, or we should have learned our lesson, about democracy promotion. So overall, I see the discussion about trying to intervene to defend Taiwan as something that has very few benefits for the United States and would have astronomical costs. We're talking the military costs would be in the tens or hundreds of thousands of U.S. casualties. There's a high risk of nuclear escalation. These are not things that we should be really even contemplating for something that has so little strategic value in my view. Now, I am an outlier in D.C. There's not many people who argue this, but it is increasing debate about whether or not defending Taiwan is in U.S. interests. I just finished an expert survey where I actually found pretty wide disagreement about how the U.S. should respond, which I was surprised by. And I think it suggests a growing recognition that this type of intervention, we shouldn't assume that this is in U.S. interests, that the first question shouldn't be what legal obligations exist or what can the U.S. do, but is this really something that's in U.S. interests? Now, to get to your second piece of your question, I think part of the reason why this debate is opening up is because the military balance is shifting in China's favor quite dramatically and quite quickly. And that is changing how people think about this cost-benefit analysis. You even saw someone like Bridge Colby in his testimony. In his book, he's pretty clear that he sees defending Taiwan as an existential U.S. interest. In his testimony, he didn't say that. He said it was a vital interest, but not an existential one. And part of that, I think, is watching this military balance shift. When we made the initial commitments to Taiwan in the Six Assurances and when strategic ambiguity position was initially put in place, the military balance looked very different. Defending Taiwan would have been much easier because China didn't have the independent military capabilities it does now. So just looking at the military balance, to talk about it briefly, if China were to move on Taiwan, what the United States would need to do is either sink all the ships in the Taiwan Strait before they got there, or find some way with Taiwanese help to make sure that any number of Chinese soldiers that land on Taiwan are wiped out before they can mass enough forces to assault the island, to move off the beaches and move up the island to take control of the rest. Meanwhile, China would be bombarding major cities, trying to assassinate leaders, using cyber attacks and other types of campaigns. They would do everything possible to prevent a U.S. intervention. So this is the significance of their moving their forces around to the east side of Taiwan. That being able to do that is the way that they would prevent the United States from getting close enough to be able to help Taiwan. So the United States would face real challenges. Number one, in getting its aircraft and ships into position to be able to execute any of these tasks. China has what's known as an anti-access air denial bubble around it, which it maintains with a huge stock of missiles. So anything that moved even close to the first island chain would just probably be wiped out. Most U.S. air bases, if the United States were to intervene, would be wiped out. Runways would be cratered, so you couldn't use them. Aircraft would be destroyed. So anything trying to get in, at least in the early days, would be very difficult. So Taiwan would have to hold out on its own for an extended period of time. It's not clear it can do that. U.S. forces, ground forces on the first island chain would be incredibly vulnerable. As soon as they fired their weapons, they'd be very easy for Chinese satellites to find. Drones and other things would take them out. So you're looking at a situation here where the United States would be struggling just to get forces into the theater. We haven't even talked about whether or not the United States has enough missiles and air defense to protect forces and to actually execute an offensive campaign or to try to take out Chinese ships. The answer to those questions right now is probably not. We don't have the defense industrial base capacity. This isn't a place where the so-called Trump doctrine of overwhelming force in short periods of time would work. You bomb China, you're going to get bombed back. So it's not a case where you can use this model that the Trump administration is trying to advocate for. And so I see this as something that has very high cost and the prospects of success are mixed. Now that does not mean it will succeed. So my final point here is just some of the challenges China would face. I actually see the biggest barriers to a Chinese takeover of Taiwan as not US imposed, but as limits on its own military capacity and geographic. So as Dale alluded to, an amphibious invasion would be incredibly difficult. This would be the most complex military operation in history. Only 13% of amphibious invasions without air superiority succeed. Air superiority means that planes can fly wherever they want. So Israel had air superiority over Iran during the 12-Day War. Russia does not have air superiority over Ukraine. I just got back, no F-16s flying over Kyiv. So that's a big difference. China probably would not have air superiority over Taiwan, so this would be very difficult. Once it did get across, it would be faced with drones and anti-ship missiles and sea mines, as well as unfavorable geography. It would have to get up off the beach, and then it would be tasked with taking over an island that is that hates it, right, with people who are willing to fight back, fighting an urban warfare campaign. So this would be extremely difficult. Its military is untested, has not fought in combat in a long time. We don't know the effects of corruption. We don't know if their Chinese economy can withstand it. A protracted war. And we saw in Ukraine that numbers aren't everything. So even if China's military looks overwhelmingly powerful on paper, we don't know what that translates to in military capacity. So for these reasons, I actually agree with Dale that a Chinese military takeover of Taiwan, even a blockade, are very unlikely because they'd just be so hard and not that likely to succeed. That doesn't change my view that if they were to happen, the U.S. shouldn't get involved.
Thank you. Well, we've heard quite a bit about policy prescriptions. Let's turn to the legal side of things and legal obligations, should any actually exist. So, Professor Koo, the Taiwan Relations Act has been on the books in the United States since 1979. From a legal standpoint, does the TRA impose any binding legal obligation for the United States to defend Taiwan, or is it best understood as merely a policy declaration that does not enjoy the force of law?
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the chance to talk about this and to hear this really sort of interesting different views on the subject, which is really important and complicated. And now I'm about to bring law into this conversation, maybe for the first time today, which is kind of remarkable for Fed Society, but I may bore you guys too. But let me just sort of say that, so the key law here, as Michael mentioned, is the Taiwan Relations Act. And here I think the way to think about this is that, so we have different arguments. Should we have more deterrence, less deterrence? What should the U.S. do? And the Taiwan Relations Act should be understood as a way to understand what the United States has actually said it would do, right? It's a statement by the United States government as to what United States policy toward Taiwan is. And why do we pass it in the form of a law? I think, from a political science point of view, one way to think about this is as a way to have a credible commitment that this is actually what U.S. policy is. As you know, U.S. policy can change over time. It's the same reason why we make defense treaties. So to give you a little context, the Taiwan Relations Act is an act of Congress. It was enacted by Congress. It was signed by President Carter, and it was enacted as a response to President Carter's decision to terminate the United States Taiwan Mutual Defense Treaty and recognized the People's Republic of China in 1979. And so the goal here was Congress is trying to take back, to the extent it could under the Constitution, some aspect of Taiwan policy going forward. And so let me just answer the question straight up. It is a law of the United States under the Constitution enacted. It is legally binding in that sense, right? It's any law of the United States is that's passed by Congress and signed by the President is legally binding under the Constitution. But that doesn't mean it can be enforced by a lawsuit in U.S. courts. So that's, I think, that's a lawyer's distinction, but an important one. Every member of the United States executive branch or United States government has to take an oath to swear to uphold and defend the Constitution and the laws of the United States. That doesn't, so therefore, it doesn't mean only if I get sued, right? So, and those of you who've served in government know that in theory, what you need, a law passed by Congress is not nothing, right? You can't just ignore it. So it's legally binding in that broad sense. And so in that sense, it's just as legally binding as any other law passed by Congress and just as legally binding as a treaty commitment such as NATO or the U.S.-Japan Treaty. Now, the more micro question is, does the language of the Taiwan Relations Act actually require or commit the United States to do anything, or what does it commit the United States to do? And here we do have, I think, most people focus on the declarations of policy in the Taiwan Relations Act. And I think the declarations of policy, we'll talk about this. Again, I think the lawyer immediately says, well, that's not law, it's policy, right? But actually, Congress has a role under the Constitution in setting U.S. policy, not a complete role, but it is not also a non-existent role either. So they do have a role, and to the extent Congress has a role in setting policy for the United States, I think it's fair to say this is a policy that the United States is binding under U.S. law. So a couple of provisions in the TRA that affect the United States commitments to Taiwan. One, the TRA says that the peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits are in the political, security, and economic interests of the United States and are matters for international concern. So this commits the United States to treat Taiwan as a security interest. And the use of the phrase international concern is language under international law that suggests this is not a domestic Chinese matter. The United States cannot, or as a matter of policy, does not view China-Taiwan as a domestic matter left to domestic Chinese law. The other provision of the TRA that's particularly important, it says the United States opposes any action using other than peaceful means that is to coerce Taiwan or reunification of China or unification of China. And here, the phrase other than peaceful means that the United States has committed itself to be opposed to the use of force other than peaceful means. And if there is a use of force in the Taiwan Strait, the United States will treat this as a threat to peace and security and a matter of great concern. The phrase peace and security under international law is usually used by in circumstances where you go to under the UN Charter to the United Nations Security Council and say this is a threat to international peace and security, therefore the United Nations Security Council has an obligation under the UN Charter to take action to stop it because it's a threat to peace and security under the UN Charter. This is international law lingo, but the reason this phrase exists is because it's a signal under international law that this is something the United States treats as a matter of significance. And that it's a matter that would typically, under the UN system, mean you go to the UN Security Council and you ask the United Nations Security Council to take action to stop or block or sanction or even to take military action in response. And the U.S. has historically said if it's a threat to international peace and security, that's something that could justify the United States itself as using force. So in the end of the day, the question is this binding? What does it bind the United States to do? It doesn't bind the United States in the same way the NATO treaty binds the United States to defend Europe or binds the United States to defend Japan. So there's no sort of, in that sense, it's not the same. Although it's one thing to keep in mind, these sort of binding obligations under international law, under treaties, all these are statements that ultimately the President will and the Congress have to decide whether to carry out. Even under the under the NATO agreement, a use of force does not automatically trigger U.S. involvement. President and Congress still have to decide what to do in response. So I guess one way to think about this is that the Taiwan Relations Act does not legally bind the United States to defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack, but technically none of these other things technically bind the United States to do something either. the United States President and Congress still have to make a decision. And ultimately, this is still about political support. The United States has a legal obligation to defend every single country in Central and South America under the Rio Treaty, but we've all forgotten that we did take this on, right? And would this ever actually happen? On the flip side, the United States has never signed any formal agreement to support or defend Israel. But there's a lot of support for, and no doubt that the United States would support and defend Israel in ways that perhaps it wouldn't even for some countries like Brazil, for instance, where it has a treaty obligation. So we don't want to overstate the importance of these legal obligations. I guess in the end of the day, I'll just sort of answer the question, which is, I don't think there is a legal obligation under the United States to defend Taiwan against military attack. I also think, though, that we should take the act of Congress signed by the President very seriously. And what I think it does mean is that actually the United States cannot legally abandon Taiwan, perhaps in the way that Ms. Kavanaugh suggested, in the sense that the United States has already committed over 50 years now, 45 years, that this is, the United States will provide weapons for Taiwan to defend itself. It will treat Taiwan as a matter of international concern. That's a threat to peace and security of the United States. These are broad commitments over a very long period of time that the United States has enacted, and was enacted in order to make sure the United States government over a long period of time had a credible commitment to take action if there's a threat to peace and security in the Taiwan Straits. To walk away from that, I think, would be a shift, a dramatic shift, and inconsistent with the policies set out in the Taiwan Relations Act.
Well, I'm going to stay with you for
Yes.
a minute, Professor Koo. So Dr. Kavanaugh advocated really a policy of abstention. Would such a policy of completely abstaining violate the TRA or the United States' obligations thereunder? And if so, what would the remedy, you briefly touched on sort of the lack of ability to enforce, but so what would the remedy be?
So the TRAs, I think, there's a couple things to think about. The TRA is obviously a broad statement of, Congress and the United States President got together and said, this is what we think U.S. policy toward Taiwan should be. And so the remedy, I think the way the enforcement would work, though, is that, and this is a very DC thing, if there's not a lawsuit in court, which I don't think is, this is essentially where members of Congress and members of the executive branch would have to take seriously their obligations to follow what the TRA does, right? So Congress has oversight power, it has funding power. It would, I think, be within its constitutional rights to say, if the administration walked away from Taiwan, that this is a departure from the TRA. This is and Congress should be consulted, and Congress could take measures to, with the typical things, block nominations, withhold funding, in ways to force the United States to sort of live up to its commitments under the TRA. Now, would it violate the TRA? Well, it depends on what the United States does, right? For the United States to declare up front that it does not consider Taiwan to be an issue of international concern or a matter of the United States concern, that the threat of the use of force is not something the United States would treat as a matter of international concern, that it would treat as a threat to its own security interests, that would be a change in U.S. policy. I think that would violate the language of the TRA. I think if it was more subtle, something happened and the United States did nothing, then I think that's a little murkier, because it's more just it's more of a question of enforcement. Can the United States actually act in the middle of a crisis? But I think a shift in U.S. policy, the United States says up front, if China invades Taiwan, the United States will do nothing. I think that would violate the TRA, at least the declaration of policy. That would be a shift in the way the United States policy has been for 45 years, and the judgment of the United States Congress and the President at the time. So I do think, and Congress, I think, would be within its rights, and the public would be within its rights to say, this is a change, this is a dramatic change from U.S. law. And so why are you doing this? And we should, I think, hold the President accountable for shifting.
Thank you. Well, speaking of shifts in U.S. policy, Steve, I'm going to come back to you. So the previous administration made statements that indicated a move in United States policy, a shift in U.S. policy away from strategic ambiguity and arguably, therefore, towards greater strategic clarity. In your opinion, has the second Trump administration followed its predecessor towards greater strategic clarity, or has it reverted back to the policy of strategic ambiguity? And do you think that strategic ambiguity might invite some sort of miscalculation by Beijing?
Well, the terminology and where people are going with the terminology is a little bit fraught, and this is not directed at Michael, it's directed at sort of the discourse that we have about this. The Biden statements that were made repeatedly, where he basically said if Taiwan was attacked, America would respond or would intervene, or whatever formulation he had on that given day, there were two things that were, I think, absolute truths in those instances. Within hours, or maybe even minutes, of the president making those utterances, there was a cleanup on aisle 9 by senior staff leaking all over the place to the press, suggesting that the president didn't mean what he said. So I ask you, if you're sitting in Beijing, were you scared or deterred by that president at that time and what he said, or were you reassured by the people who were the sentient beings actually talking to you about policy, saying that they were holding back or muddying those statements? Was that clarity or was that ambiguity? It's widely covered as if it was clarity. So we have the words that we use to describe the situation. With President Trump, he has repeatedly said he will not foreshadow what he would do in response to something in a time of crisis. Is that strategic clarity, or is that tactical ambiguity, or what is it? Well, what you're getting are sort of two versions of the same thing. And I think it would be, in some ways, crazy for the United States to give serious details about all the many options it might contemplate. In some ways, there's a theory of deterrence that if Beijing either questions that the United States might actually do some things that are borderline crazy and damaging to them, that maybe they would take fewer risks. Now, that's a little bit of the crazy uncle theory of deterrence. But there's no circumstance we would put our whole playbook out in the open. That would be tactical clarity. It would give them time and opportunity to plan, to thwart, confuse, whatever else. The strategic part gets a little bit to what the TRA's language is, which also is ambiguous. I mean, to say that something is a threat to America's national interest doesn't really say, does that mean you're moving in the 7th Fleet? Does that mean you're going to have a B-2 stealth mission that's going to hit a strategic facility in China to make them think twice? Does that mean you're going to have an all-hands space-based cyber attack over critical infrastructure in China, so they have to worry about their sustainability in a time of crisis? Does it mean that you're going to send an angry letter to the United Nations so they can have a meeting mirroring the Ukraine situation where an attack happens, and guess who's chairing the emergency meeting of the UN Security Council but the aggressor? And expecting that that's going to result in some kind of a change. All of those things, as matters of responses, are in the basket of we consider this to be a grave concern and we will respond, but it doesn't say what we would do to respond. So in my view, I think that the United States should basically rest where I think Secretary Rubio summed it up, that as we look at American interests with balanced relations with allies and sustainability of economic and security commitments, that we want the status quo of the Taiwan Strait to be preserved, and we will resist any use of force to change that status quo. The main change in that formulation for the very few borderline insane people that follow every word that goes in these games is it's not considering voicing free speech in Taiwan to be a legitimate equivalent threat to the status quo, whereas past administrations have explicitly suggested that if there were certain views expressed in Taiwan by their elected leaders or otherwise, or if there was a referendum to amend their constitution or what have you, that those expressions would threaten the status quo, and there was almost an equal balance of trying to deter Taiwan from being too pretty and worthy of attack versus trying to deter the actual aggressor preparing to attack. So I think there's some balancing that can go in that regard. I have a hard time shoehorning this into the dialogue about strategic clarity versus ambiguity. But I would think that the United States is in the best possible position. And I also don't see this as just about Taiwan. I don't think that there is any alliance with Japan that survives a conflict where military force is used to control Taiwan and America does nothing to respond. There's not a shred of foundation for Japan to think, well, if China was able to do that with impunity against Taiwan, what is so exceptional about Taiwan, which after all was a 50-year colony of Japan, and there's still some legacy ties that go beyond just policy in that relationship. Why would they think that none of that would apply to them, and the U.S. might also take a pass in that kind of provocation very far from our shores? So I think there are equities beyond just, is Taiwan a beautiful island? Have we promised 23 million people that we would do certain things or led them to believe we would do certain things, whether our commitment was clear or not? I think there's more at stake than those things. But this is a long story, and I don't want to filibuster the balance of our time.
Well, I'm going to come to you, Dr. Kavanaugh, and offer you the opportunity to respond to that, given your position on abstention, in light of Professor Koo laying out the quasi-legal obligations that we have, or at least legal commitments that we've made, and Steve laying out some of the strategic implications of doing nothing, both within the Taiwan Strait and then further beyond to Japan and some other interests. So what is your response to those assertions?
Sure, so I'll make a few points. The first is that thank you. Sorry, I've had pneumonia for 2 months and my voice never came back, so it's still a little weak. So first, I think that there's a lot the U.S. could do to meet the requirements of the TRA without sending military forces to defend the island. So that's what I've really argued against here, which is the U.S. getting directly involved. I think the United States should continue to send arms to help Taiwan prepare for any type of military aggression by China. I think that even in the context of a war, the United States should be preparing for some kind of Ukraine option, which is to continue to arm Taiwan in the midst of a conflict. I recognize that that's much harder than it is for in the case of Ukraine, where we can just drive weapons across the Polish border. I think that doesn't mean that we shouldn't start preparing or that we should abandon attempts to have such an option. That's what Stephen Wertheim and I argued in our Foreign Affairs. Our article was that the United States should be actively thinking about what that looks like and developing capabilities to execute it. So that's, those things I think are well within the bounds of what the United States should be considering. I agree the status quo is the best option. I just don't see military means as the best way necessarily to preserve those options. As far as, the deciding that we're not, stating outright that we're not going to send military forces to defend Taiwan as being a change of policy, my question would be, does that mean that forever the United States can never change its policy towards Taiwan? I guess I find that to be very unpalatable for any policymaker. These commitments made to Taiwan were made a very long time ago when the world looked different and the military balance looked different and U.S. interests were different. To me, we should be having a debate about whether this is still in U.S. interests or not. We should be willing to change policy. We can't say this because a policy was set in the 1970s, it can never be changed. To me, that's the wrong way to approach U.S. foreign policy. All U.S. foreign policy should be up for debate as resources and balances of power and facts on the ground to change. And the Rio Treaty was taken seriously initially. It was something that was serious, and over time it has evolved to not be serious because U.S. interests have changed. And so that should be the case for all policies. It should be the case for NATO alliances, it should be the case for other U.S. alliances in Asia, and it should be the case for this one, in my view. As far as the point about Japan, I agree that if the United States did not defend Taiwan, people in Japan and allies around the world would be asking, am I next? Am I the next one? I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. What happens in that case? Well, the most likely is that they start arming themselves, and that would be my preferred outcome. What's so sacred about any sort of alliance? I think the U.S.-Japan alliance has some benefit for the United States, but if Japan became so the main value is that it keeps Japan from being under China's thumb, and I don't think having a Chinese regional hegemony is necessarily in U.S. interests. But you could achieve that with a Japan, excuse me, that is so militarily capable that there's no chance that China could take it over. And that's probably the outcome if the United States chooses not to defend Taiwan. So I guess I don't see, I recognize that a decision to not send military forces to defend Taiwan would have consequences. I don't think they're all that bad, and I don't think that we should rule it out because of a policy that was made 50 years ago. If you look at the history of U.S. military interventions, going back to the Spanish-American War, the United States has always been willing to act with military force when it's in its interests. It's never cared about what the law said. It's done what was required to protect U.S. national security and economic interests. And we should continue to operate on that trajectory, even if it requires changing policy. With the caveat that I don't think I've argued today and did not intend to argue today that we should, if China were to invade Taiwan, the United States should just shrug. I think there are a lot of things, though, the U.S. could do that are short of sending U.S. military forces to defend the island directly.
Okay, so I'll amend my characterization to military abstention, but not necessarily other means. And that actually dovetails nicely with the question I want to ask you, Dr. Copeland, which is, in the context of great power competitions, what are the tools available to manage those flashpoints that fall short of direct conflict?
Well, to respond, I think I need to just also frame my remarks relative to what's been said. The key aspect of deterrence overall, and deterrence and containment often get lumped together, but deterrence is a psychological equation where one great power is trying to tell the other, if you do something we don't like, we will raise the costs and risks of that action to you. Now, it might be we take over your country, but that's not going to happen here. What we are trying to do with our signaling to China, and to Taiwan, by the way, is to tell them, if we don't like your behavior, we will make the costs and risks high. So let's start with the point about strategic ambiguity. Harry Harding at UVA has always said that this is not really an ambiguous policy. It's what he would call dual deterrence. We deter Taiwan by saying, if you declare independence, then all bets are off. We may not, support you. We also say to Taiwan simultaneously, if you attack Taiwan out of the blue, i.e. without a declaration of independence to provoke you, then we will almost certainly or very likely support Taiwan. That's not really that ambiguous, and indeed Biden's policy of stating we would defend was basically saying, yes, we would defend if you attack it out of the blue. So there's a conditionality there that is the underpinning of deterrence. But I said there are three aspects of the deterrence strategy. One is the direct dependence, and Jennifer and I agree that this is a very hard operation. It's a very hard operation to cross 90 miles of difficult sea. Think about how hard D-Day was. But the other aspect of this is that it's also very hard to keep Taiwan integrated into the world economy, even if you succeed. And this is an aspect of where Bloomberg News basically said, China is so dependent upon the world economy that it would suffer more than 15% decline in its GDP, even if it were successful, because of the disruptions in global value chains and the likely impact on sanctioning by allies as well as the US, of course. And this is not including raw material cutoffs. So if you think about that impact, this is a very important dimension of what I'm calling the third pillar, the economic deterrent. But I also think we need to look at this question of, is China even worried about economic cutoffs? Some in the administration have argued, or at least in their previous lives have argued, that, we don't have to worry about the third pillar, economic punishment, because China's prepared for this. It's stockpiled some oil, 3 to 6 months. It's got some raw materials sitting waiting to go. One thing we have to remember is that China is in a new economy. This is not 1941, where if Japan had 6 to 12 months of oil on the ground, it might have been okay. No, China is totally integrated. So if the global value chain system collapse, the integration of exports and imports, the ability of Taiwan to invest into China would collapse, and this is very important for China. It gets a lot of investment from Taiwan. And not to mention what happens, as Jennifer alluded to, if in the war itself, the Taiwan chip manufacturers, the highest tech ones in the world, are hurt. This would disrupt all of those critical chips that are under 10 nanometers that are critical to China doing what it is doing already, which is to be at the forefront of EVs, electric vehicles, AI, and of course its growth in its military and its qualitative growth to catch up to a quantitatively superior, strategically superior US. So in all of those aspects, I think we have to actually come back to the economic foundations of the whole relationship and on what would China suffer if it were to attack out of the blue a Taiwan. It would get a lot of people coming down on it. It wouldn't require the U.S., and this is maybe where I differ from Jennifer, it wouldn't require the U.S. to get militarily involved, say boots on the ground, or even flying military planes to shoot down Chinese military planes. That's that second pillar of escalation on the slippery slope that neither side really wants. But it would require, and this is psychological, a signaling from any U.S. administration that there would be very high costs and risks to pay if they were to go after it. That's obviously supporting Taiwan in its military fight, direct deterrence. It's obviously saying we're going to be involved somehow, like flying resupply planes into Taiwan. Hello, we did this in the Berlin crisis, 1948-49, and Stalin said, no, we're not going to disrupt that. If we were to just simply say, Berlin crisis, we're going to do that, and resupply Taiwan from the air, what, are the Chinese going to cause a war? No. They're going to allow that, but that's not direct military intervention, but it's also that slippery slope deterrent. And if we can signal that, and Jennifer alluded to preparing for stuff like that, I think that's a really good thing, because again, it psychologically makes those costs and risks go up. And that third pillar, that's basically saying, Taiwan, you invade out of the blue, all bets are off on the economic side. We'll keep Taiwan down. We'll keep Taiwan from declaring independence, but you can't invade out of the blue.
Thank you. Well, we've heard an incredible amount of content and covered a lot of ground. Hopefully that has spurred some of you to begin thinking about questions. So we've got about 15 minutes or so remaining. If there are any questions from the audience, I invite you to queue up at the microphone. Okay, good. We've already got some people prepared. So, yes, ma'am.
Thanks. Bonnie Wachtel, and I'm in the investment business. Dr. Kavanaugh, I really appreciate hearing that contrarian point of view. And I would be more sympathetic to it, and I think President Trump would be more sympathetic to it, if the fabs had been moved. And certainly that should be a focus, is to duplicate that functionality, but at the moment they have not been moved. They are absolutely critical to the United States. And I could see that if we were to announce that this is our policy, you know, instead of the ambiguity, we're going to use a Ukraine model, I can see the people in Taiwan deciding, look, Ukraine is a failure, and we do not intend to destroy our population here for the benefit of somebody else to resist China. They'll just turn over the keys. I mean, suppose the fabs are not blown up or could be immediately redone. Does that bother you in terms of turning over all of that semiconductor, high-tech intelligence and capability over to China?
Just a great question, a really important point. So I'll make a few responses. So first, China is working hard to develop its own semiconductor production capabilities. I believe that in the near term, it will have capabilities that are just as advanced as the United States and Taiwan do. So I think that in the near term, this won't be a question. Most of the IP, or the intellectual property, that the TSMC requires to produce those semiconductors does not actually live on Taiwan. So if China were to take over Taiwan and those semiconductor fabs were to survive, then the West could just kind of cut off that technology. TSMC requires not only IP from the United States, but also from Europe. So I guess I see the risks of China getting its hands on sensitive IP as being pretty low. Also, I think that when I said that there would be a war over Taiwan would destroy the semiconductor fabs, I think it's not out of the question that the United States would be the one to destroy them to prevent just the outcome that you're suggesting. And I think that you're right, that it should be a much higher priority than it is to get the United States to a place where it can produce all the semiconductors it needs domestically, or at least in places that are a little bit less at risk than Taiwan. That's not the world that we live in right now, though. If you look at reports from semiconductor manufacturing industry, it suggests that by 2030, the United States could have about 30% production of those very most advanced chips. So that would provide some resilience. Another option would be to increasingly stockpile second generation, like chips that are almost as good. Because the only places that really need the most advanced chips are military technologies. So most life could continue with chips that are not quite as good. The problem there is that China is the leading producer of those, and there's not a lot of policy support for stockpiling things that you'd have to buy directly from China. I still think it's something the United States should be paying a lot more attention to. I agree that this should be a high priority. I guess I still don't think that the semiconductor fabs alone are a reason to send military forces to defend Taiwan.
Good morning, Patrick Wilson. I work for a Taiwanese chip company. Jennifer, I have a different question for you, Professor, but I would want to correct the record on one thing you just said, which is that the most advanced chips are used in military applications, and that's just flatly not true.
Okay.
There are actually, I can't think of a single military system that relies on chips that are newer than 5 years old. Not a single one. None of our aviation assets. Some compute, which we do use compute to do military tasks, but they're just repurposing civilian technology. The Defense Department, certainly ours, but every other defense department in the world, they are lagging buyers of technology, usually on average a decade behind the most advanced chips. The most advanced chips in the world are actually in cell phones, right? The ones that will be delivered this year at 2 nanometers, the smallest in the history of humanity, the most complex devices ever conceived in the history of humanity. Those will go to consumer devices, millions and millions of them sold in stores all over the world. Those are the most advanced technologies, not anything used by the Defense Department unless the soldiers pick it up out of their pocket and give ChatGPT a cool question, because that happens. So my question is actually a different question, and that is, what do we learn from China's propaganda that they spew into Taiwan? And I think this is something perhaps, Michael, for the whole panel to think about. I would say the number one message that Beijing pumps into Taiwan is America is an unreliable partner. You can't depend on America. They're a fickle, unreliable partner, and if it's not good for them, they'll abandon you. That's what China spends its money getting into the press in Taiwan, is to undermine Taiwan's dependence on the United States, which I think is interesting. The second and most popular question in Taiwan today, which I would say is the biggest credibility crisis for the US, is everyone in Taiwan, I would say the great majority of the public who are paying close attention in Taiwan, they are very concerned about the United States is just going to trade our democracy for soybeans. So the economic question, nothing we've touched on in this panel thus far, is that the United States is just going to make a unilateral decision that it wants more economic activity. They want to sell more AI chips to China. They want more soybeans. And they'll just trade Taiwan's democracy for that. So I wonder what the panel thinks of those two observations about the state of communication or
Who wants to
conversation in
volunteer to take a stab at the first question?
So I think this touches on an interesting point, which is that the broader problem here is that if we want to have, I think, a credible deterrence, which I think everyone on the panel wants to have, you almost have to, as Professor Copeland and Professor Kaplan, you actually have to make a very credible commitment. And one of the problems of the United States is that the United States is just a wacky country. Like, our system is kind of confusing to everyone outside the United States, including to Americans, right? Who's in charge? And so that's why things like laws are helpful in sort of crystallizing what our policies are to some degree. Now, just to make a point, we shouldn't be stuck with things forever, but we have a process for changing it. And so that's why if you make a law, the way you change a law is by passing another law. And that makes the legal commitments credible. A treaty is sort of a similar idea. And I think that's one of the ways we can sort of hopefully deal with this, which is sort of the problem the United States has is that we cannot make a commitment that people actually trust. Because I think every president comes in and flips the script and switches what we did 4 years ago. One of the things that would be nice is if we had, that's why those treaties that we signed in 1949 with NATO, or even the Taiwan Relations Act, they slow down that process of flipping, right? It makes it harder, it creates more political obstacles, even for President Trump to walk away from NATO, or a future president to walk away from Taiwan. It doesn't prevent it. U.S. can always change its policy, but it slows down. And those kinds of, the law here, in some ways, can be helpful in making the U.S. commitments a little more credible than they are. But I do agree, ultimately, they are political commitments, and there needs to be political support in the United States for these commitments to be credible. But the law can actually stretch out and smooth out and strengthen at least some of the credibility of our commitments over a longer period of time than 4 years. And I think this is important because if we don't have the ability to make a credible commitment, we don't really have as much deterrence as we think we do, right? And so that's kind of, and the weird thing is that the less deterrence you give, the more likely you then have to do things you don't want to do, like use military force in Taiwan. So there's a certain irony in that it would be better to like bluff your way into this unless your bluff gets called. You actually do want to say, I would actually use military force, and that will make it hopefully less likely that you do, that you won't. But this is a conundrum with our system, and the law is, I think, a measured way to at least strengthen the way the United States speaks on the world stage.
Tyranny of time, but there's always going to be editing. We have big, wide open questions. We could go forever on a lot of these topics, and it's all worthy. This issue of the sense of abandonment in Taiwan, I've experienced that for my entire adult life. The shock of the 1970s and those changes were the seeds for that, and it's perpetuated through every American administration to varying degrees, and probably will continue because they live with every single day. The promise of law or America or anything else doesn't stop something coming out of the blue from China, and that's just been reality for them for decades and decades. The vicissitudes of our process. I'm not one for overturning the Constitution and saying we should have longer presidential terms or other kinds of changes that might give some continuity. But again, just drawing lessons from another region that I think are relevant to this. It is necessary for us to find ways to have more enduring commitments in certain policy priorities if the response we need from allies is longer-term manufacturing or investment capabilities that take longer than a presidential term to materialize. And we ran into this head first in the broader Middle East, where we had a first Trump term moving in the direction of the Abraham Accords that was balanced against with maximum pressure against Iran. There was an opening of opportunity, there was a rebalancing of deterrence, and then when the Biden administration came in, immediately there was a reopening of negotiation with Iran, and there were some questions on some of the other things. Leave aside Trump, Biden, whatever else, at least at the strategic level of consideration, if we have a major pivot about where our commitments and equities really are that will make it difficult for leaders in private sector but in government to make longer than 4-year commitments to what they're doing with their raw materials, manufacturing, and industry. That's a constraining environment. Maybe that's what we have to live with, but to the extent we can escape that tyranny, I think that's some of what Julian was alluding to. It gives more breathing space to have some reliability in that regard. And I do think that having more independently capable allies is a net value add to the United States and a net complication to adversaries that want to change the status quo. But at its core, you have to have still a theory of how you're going to honor those alliances, and they have to feel reassured too. And those are the mix of things that I don't think have changed that much administration to administration, but because we've chosen to have presidential terms, and I'm not a lawyer, and I recognize I'm talking to the Federalist Society, but I'm pretty sure that under the Constitution there is a broad swath of authority that is given to one branch of the United States government and to one chief executive in particular on this. And so, of course, the 1 to 2 terms and those shifts have a consequential effect on the balancing or bandwagging of allies.
We have time for one more question, and we have one more asker, so that's good.
My name is Isaac Martin. I had a question following up for you, Dr. Kavanaugh. 2 clarifications about the factual statements you made about the deterrence for Taiwan. First of all, when it comes to air superiority, Taiwan vis-a-vis China, if there are anti-access concerns that would face the United States, what would prevent those same rockets that would prevent United States air intervention from knocking down the F-16 that Taiwan has, A? And then B, about the resistant populace, there seems to be some noise that not everyone in Taiwan is equally an avid supporter of the free and independent Taiwanese government. How would you address both those concerns? What are the anti-access concerns, A, and then B, what percentage of the population would actually be resistant? Thank you.
So on the first part, so achieving air superiority in today's military environment is quite difficult because of drones and cheap missiles. So China clearly would have an air advantage, and it would clearly be able to operate with a lot of flexibility, especially if the United States stayed out, towards Taiwan. And over time, it might be able to achieve air superiority where it could fly over Taiwan and drop bombs. But if Taiwan were to build up its stockpiles of anti-aircraft missiles and cheap drones and other types of things, it could complicate China's ability to control the airspace over the Taiwan Strait. Clearly, Taiwan cannot control that airspace, so it would be contested airspace. But that would just slightly limit and complicate the way that China would operate. And I think you see this in Ukraine very clearly. Ukraine didn't have any F-16s at the start of the war, and still, with anti-aircraft missiles and drones and other types of capabilities, they've been able to keep Russia from flying its fighter jets over Ukrainian territory. Now, Russia can still launch glide bombs that hit Ukrainian targets, but they still cannot. They still do not have confidence to fly their fighter jets over Ukrainian cities because Ukraine has enough air defense to contest the space. And so I'll just, you want to jump in on that?
No, I just keep going.
So then I'll just, on the question of the population resilience, yeah, that's an open question. It's debated. Some people suggest that there's not that significant will to fight. Some people suggest that there is that significant will to fight. It's possible that if China puts enough pressure in terms of blockading the island and starving it and cyber attacks and other types of gray zone pressure, that the population doesn't fight that much, and it's pretty easy for China to move up the island. But it wouldn't take that much in terms of like insurgent resistance to pose significant challenges. I mean, China would have to move through difficult geographic terrain and then through all of Taiwan's major cities. And so that would be complicated urban warfare. And we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially Iraq, how difficult that urban warfare can be, even for a really powerful military facing a limited number of poorly armed insurgent groups. So I still think it would be a military challenge.
I think we're going to let you have the last word, but okay. Just a note, you are all that stands between us and lunch. So.
Oh my gosh, and that's resources, so we need those. Very quickly, actually, returning to the notion that deterrence is a psychological game, you don't need to have the other believe that you're 100% committed to doing things, or even 80% likely to do these things, or that you will impose every single cost measure in your arsenal, your quiver. What you need to be able to do, and I think actually Jennifer and I agree quite a lot on this, which is that you need to be able to convince China that the costs across the board, including direct invasion of the island, are going to be very high and and the probabilities of success are not that high. And we didn't talk a lot about it, but the lessons of Ukraine are very powerful for the Chinese leadership. And those lessons are, you can think you're going to go into a war that's, 6 weeks, as the Germans, some Germans thought in 1914, and suddenly you're into a 3-4 year conflict, which devastates your economy, causes super hyperinflation. And China is not Russia. China has 1.3 billion concentrated in 1/3 of the territory. And that's a real domestic nightmare that China wants to avoid.
Very good. Well, I know that I, for one, have learned a lot from each of our panelists, and so I am grateful to each of you for participating and contributing your thoughts. I know I did my best to draw out some of the contrast between your positions, but each of you, you're far too civil and polite. I was hoping for, perhaps a little more heat, but it is a Tuesday morning and right before lunch, so maybe that had something to do with it. Yes, and some of us are suffering from jet lag as well. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you didn't catch it, lunch will be in the district room, which is downstairs. You have to take the elevators or the stairs at the front of the hotel. And with that, please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists.
Thank you, Steve. I enjoyed listening to you. You have a lot of, you know so much. You're